Excellencies, High Commissioner, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the first meeting of the 29th Special Session of the Human Rights Council. As announced yesterday at the open-ended informative consultation, the request for a special session of the Council on the human rights implications of the crisis in Myanmar was received on 8 February 2021 at 11:30 a.m. The request for this special session is supported by the following members of the Council: Argentina, Austria, the Bahamas, Brazil, Bulgaria, Czechia, Denmark, Fiji, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Libya, Malawi, Marshall Islands, Mexico, the Netherlands, Poland, the Republic of Korea, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and Uruguay. The request is also supported by the following observer states: Australia, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Estonia, Finland, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Monaco, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, and the United States of America. In accordance with Council Resolution 5/1, the Secretariat communicated the request for the holding of a special session to all Member States and made the information available to the specialized agencies, other intergovernmental organizations, and national human rights institutions, as well as to non-government organizations in consultative status with ECOSOC, pursuant to the Council's Rules of Procedure. As announced during the open-ended informative consultation held yesterday, the online inscription for the list of speakers was opened yesterday. The speaking time will be 2 minutes and 30 seconds for Member States and 1 minute and 30 seconds for observer states and other observers. I wish to take this opportunity to recall that on the 10th of February 2021, the Bureau discussed and agreed to propose to the Council a set of extraordinary modalities for the special session, as well as modalities for virtual voting, to be applied to the 29th special session. These modalities are included in the annexures to the minutes of the Bureau meeting. Allow me to recall Annex 1 of the Bureau minutes on the proposed extraordinary modalities for the 29th special session for consideration by the Council. The number of delegates in the Assembly Hall would be managed in order not to exceed the limit of 5 delegates being present at the same time. State delegations will be strongly encouraged to send pre-recorded video statements. In the case that pre-recorded video statements would not be technically possible or could not be submitted within the set deadline, states could alternatively deliver their statements through live link via Zoom. Only those state delegations who are unable to pre-record video messages or participate via Zoom could exceptionally deliver their statements from the Assembly Hall, while also respecting the 5-person limit and in consultation with the HRC Secretariat. Delegations would be able to raise points of order without being in the room by alerting the Secretariat via the chat box in Zoom or by calling the podium hotline 079-421-9948. The chair would then stop the debate and give the floor through the Zoom platform to the delegation that has raised the point of order. Delegations would be able to exercise their right of reply remotely in the same manner as during the 45th regular session by sending a request to HRC list of speakers at ohchr.org. The Secretariat would register the request and inform the representative of the estimated time for the right of reply segment. The representative will then be called upon during the right of reply segment in the order of the requests received. The same health and safety measures that were applied during the 45th regular session of the Human Rights Council and the 36th and the 37th sessions of the UPR Working Group would continue to be applied in a very strict manner. Additionally, as I mentioned yesterday, I am also proposing that the Council adopt a decision according to which, given the impossibility to organize NGO participation in person, NGOs in consultative status with ECOSOC would be provided exceptionally the opportunity to submit pre-recorded video statements for the 29th special session. In order to balance the importance of inclusivity and what is feasible in terms of time and resources, the list of speakers for NGOs for the 29th special session will be set to 18 speakers, in line with the average number of NGOs that participated in the past 3 special sessions that were held in 2018, 2017, and 2016, respectively. Should the modalities be adopted, this would be referred to as a decision in the report of this special session. Lastly, in case there is a request for a vote, the Bureau proposes that the voting process for the 29th special session exceptionally takes the form of a virtual roll call vote via Zoom, as described in Annex 2 to the minutes of the Bureau meeting of the 10th of February 2021. The voting process will replicate as closely as possible a roll call vote organized in person with utmost care regarding security and transparency. As I mentioned yesterday at the closure of the open-ended informative consultation, I was grateful for the flexibility displayed by all speakers in considering these proposed modalities. There was a clear sense of commitment on the part of all delegations to ensure that despite the current circumstances preventing us from meeting in person, we should nevertheless continue to meet in this hybrid environment established by our Secretariat. Obviously, these proposed modalities are not ideal, but I noted that there was no alternative solution at this stage. I wish to reiterate very clearly that these modalities, if approved by this Council, would apply exclusively to this 29th special session, which is held during a period when COVID-19 restrictions prohibit public meetings of more than 5 participants and should not serve as a precedent. Are there any delegations wishing to take the floor at this time on the proposed extraordinary modalities? Delegates who are to take the floor should wait until they have been moved into the speaker's room before beginning their statement. This is because of the short delay between the channeling of the Zoom signal to the room and the webcast. I thank you in advance for your consideration and patience. I now open the floor. I understand that there are no requests for the floor. Can I now take it that the Council agrees that the proposed modalities and included decision will be applied during the 29th special session under the current circumstances? I see no objection. It is so decided. I would like to ask for your support to ensure that this special session is carried out in an efficient and dignified manner. I appeal to all speakers to strictly respect the speaking time and to adhere to language that is consistent with the dignity that should be inherent to our decisions. I now have the honor to give the floor to the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights to make a statement. Deputy High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues. The seizure of power by the Myanmar military earlier this month constitutes a profound setback for the country after a decade of hard-won gains in its democratic transition. Those gains, which this Council reviewed less than 3 weeks ago in Myanmar's third UPR, had been reinforced by the clear results of the general elections of November 2020, now effectively betrayed by the coup and the declaration of a one-year state of emergency. Myanmar's democratically elected political leadership, including Aung San Suu Kyi and President U Win Myint, have been detained on politically motivated charges. Our office is tracking more than 350 political and state officials, activists and civil society members, including journalists, monks and students, who have been taken into custody. Several face criminal charges on dubious grounds. Most have received no form of due process and have not been permitted legal representation, family visitations, or communication. Some remain missing with no information as to their whereabouts or well-being. The High Commissioner and I greatly admire the conviction of the demonstrators, many of them young people and women from diverse ethnic backgrounds who have peacefully marched and participated in other activities to oppose the coup and the crackdown. It is they who represent Myanmar's future, a future of shared justice and equitably shared national wealth amid harmonious relationships between peoples and communities. The world is watching. Draconian orders have been issued this week to prevent peaceful assembly and free expression, and police and military presence on the streets has grown progressively over the last several days. Following violent clashes with police on 9 February, at least one woman is in critical condition. Pro-military and nationalist groups have also taken to the streets. Let us be clear. The indiscriminate use of lethal or less than lethal weapons against peaceful protesters is unacceptable. More violence against Myanmar's people will only compound the illegitimacy of the coup and the culpability of its leaders. Madam President, this crisis was born of impunity, long-standing lack of civilian control over the military, its disproportionate influence in the country's political and economic structures, and ongoing failure to genuinely account for crimes committed by the security forces over decades have combined to compromise Myanmar's democratization and indeed its development. For over 20 years, successive high commissioners and many eminent experts have briefed this council and its predecessor on violations committed by the country's military, which include some of the most serious crimes alleged under international law. Lack of action to address them has emboldened military leaders and contributed to this present crisis. As this council's own fact-finding mission warned explicitly in 2018, and I quote, "The Tatmadaw is the greatest impediment to Myanmar's development as a modern democratic nation. The Commander-in-Chief of the Tatmadaw, Min Aung Hlaing, and all the current leadership must be replaced, and a complete restructuring must be undertaken to place the Tatmadaw under full civilian control. Myanmar's democratic transition depends on it." End quote. Today, the democratic crisis that the people of Myanmar face is deepened by economic disaster wreaked by the pandemic. Already, COVID-19 has had profound impact, severely taxing a fragile health system and marginal social safety nets, driving millions of people into severe financial distress. The reckless actions of the military leadership raise the specter of a reimposition of broad sanctions on the country and could threaten many years of development gains. To the international community, I express my concern that any sanctions under consideration should be carefully targeted against specific individuals who are credibly alleged to have violated people's rights. Leaders of this coup are an appropriate focus of such actions. It is of critical importance that no harm should be inflicted on the most vulnerable people in the country, and that assistance to help fight the pandemic can continue alongside humanitarian support in conflict areas. To this Council, we recommend the strongest possible call for the military authorities to respect the result of the election, to return power to civilian control, and immediately release all individuals arbitrarily detained. They should have prompt access to legal representation and medical support, and specious criminal charges should be dropped. Internet and telecommunications restrictions must be lifted to allow media freedoms and access to information through the Internet. The courageous human rights defenders, civil society, and trade union movement that have emerged in recent years must be protected. Additionally, the military authorities must not be allowed to exacerbate the situation of the Rohingya people after the extreme violence and decades of discrimination that they have endured. Myanmar must fully comply with the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice and move to genuinely address the root causes of conflicts in Rakhine State and other ethnic minority areas. We regret that our office has long been denied a presence in Myanmar and urge the military authorities to grant OHCHR and the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Myanmar full and immediate access. To the people of Myanmar, we express our support for your rights to justice, to freedom, to democratic participation, to personal safety and security, and to peaceful, sustainable, and inclusive development. We have been greatly moved by your determination and also by the solidarity expressed by many members of ethnic groups who themselves have faced discrimination and violence. The High Commissioner and I are hopeful that from this crisis, you will be able to rebuild a country that rests on firmer democratic foundations which can ensure the equality, dignity, human rights, and the full inclusion of all in national development. And we are confident that the entire United Nations family, from its many teams on the ground to this Council and other bodies, will continue to stand together with you to uphold your legitimate aspirations for a free Myanmar. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Deputy High Commissioner. As per the established practice, special procedures mandate holders and other relevant officials contribute to this special session. I now give the floor to Mr. Thomas Andrews, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, and also on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. Mr. Andrews, Special Rapporteur, you have the floor.
Madam President, distinguished members of the UN Human Rights Council, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of my mandate and on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. In light of the subject matter of this special session today, the committee has asked me to deliver our joint presentation. Madam President, thank you for convening this special and very timely session. The very act of convening this session makes an important statement of the gravity with which this Council views the coup d'etat of a duly elected government and the events that have followed. This is the 29th time that a special session of the Human Rights Council is convened. It is noteworthy that the 27th special session was also convened to focus on illegal actions taken by the Myanmar military against its own people. In that case, the mass atrocity crimes were committed against the Rohingya ethnic minority. In other words, this is not the first time that the leaders of the Myanmar military, otherwise known as the Tatmadaw, have demonstrated their cynical belief that they are above the law. It is imperative that the Tatmadaw leadership understand that the people of Myanmar and the people of the world will not let their theft of a developing democracy stand. It is equally important that the people of Myanmar understand that they are not alone. This body and the international community will stand with them at this moment of peril and need. We are here today because of a coup that the Commander-in-Chief of the Tatmadaw argues was necessary to safeguard the country following allegations of massive voter fraud in the November 8th election. Madam President, even if election irregularities did exist, there was and is no justification for declaring a state of emergency, arresting the civilian leadership, and attempting to destroy Myanmar's fledgling democracy. The military junta even failed to follow its own requirements for taking control of the country as specified in a constitution that they themselves drafted. The coup is truly illegal in every sense of the word. The international community must refuse to recognize this illegal regime. It is clear from my observations, consultations, and discussions, opposition to the military coup is strong, and it runs across the diversity of the Myanmar people. The footage of huge crowds of determined people of all ages and backgrounds marching in the streets of Myanmar in defense of their democracy, their human rights, and the future of their children are deeply inspiring. I have seen pictures and videos of Buddhist monks and Muslim clergy marching side by side, of civil servants from various sectors striking and marching together, of doctors and nurses, construction workers, bankers and educators, of Karen, Chin, Shan, Kachin, and other ethnic groups, of the very young and the very old, even of police crossing lines and joining the protesters. This is as united as I have seen Myanmar, and it gives me great hope. The people of Myanmar are literally standing up to the Tatmadaw, despite the knowledge of what the Tatmadaw is capable of, from the massacre of democracy advocates in decades past, to the murder of monks protesting in their saffron robes, to the recent unspeakable atrocity crimes committed against the Rohingya ethnic minority. Despite the history of brutal crackdowns and with automatic weapons now trained on them, citizen protests continue to spring up in literally hundreds and hundreds of townships, large and small, throughout Myanmar. The movement of opposition and dissent is large, and it is getting larger. The response of police and security forces to the peaceful protests of a people united has gone from restraint to intimidation to bloodshed. Day after day, the people of Myanmar and people around the world have watched with horror the photos and videos of brutality emerging from the streets of Myanmar, from large columns of security forces in full riot gear surrounding peaceful protesters and water cannons being fired into crowds, to protesters being shot, including a young woman shot in the head as she stood unarmed and posing no threat with other peaceful protesters in Naypyidaw. There are growing reports and photographic evidence that Myanmar security forces have used live ammunition, lethal force against protesters. This violates international law. Arbitrary detentions and intimidation are also on the rise. Not only are political leaders targets, but community and civil society leaders as well. I recently spoke to the leader of a civil society organization that is working to build social harmony and cohesion among diverse ethnic and religious communities. This apparently makes him a threat to the Tatmadaw. At 2 a.m, following the coup, police officers woke up his wife, his mother, and his 2 young children. When his wife told the officers that he was not there, he had fled his home knowing that he was a target. They interrogated her and declared that her husband would be put under arrest as soon as he was found. Based on currently available information, since announcing the coup, the junta has detained at least 220 government officials and members of civil society. They include State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, President U Win Myint, and members of the Union Election Commission. Many of these detentions have occurred in the dark of night and many times by plainclothes police. These actions are a violation of the basic right to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention. The military must release all of them immediately. The Myanmar military is also under increasing threat from the junta. Police beat at least one journalist. Others are reporting being harassed and targeted by police. Some have gone into hiding. The junta is instituting regulations and laws to systematically abrogate the people's rights of freedom of expression, access to information, and privacy. It has banned public gatherings of 5 or more in dozens of townships and imposed curfews from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. It has blocked Facebook and other apps, cut off the internet as it sees fit, and has put forward a new draconian cybersecurity law to assure that Myanmar is truly a police state that uses modern technology to harass, intimidate, and arrest anyone who stands in their way. The new law would allow the junta to ban content it dislikes, restrict internet providers, and intercept data. Meanwhile, the Tatmadaw is doing its best to sow fear of being arrested, tortured, tear-gassed, beaten, injured, and murdered. But there is something that the people of Myanmar who I have spoken with fear even more: being forced to go back into the darkness of living under a brutal, repressive, authoritarian regime. Members of the Human Rights Council, the message from the people of Myanmar to all of you and to the people of the world is clear. This cannot stand. The activist who I referred to earlier, the individual in hiding, wanted me to tell you and that he and so many others are deeply grateful for the support that has been expressed by the United Nations and many others. But he has asked me to respectfully pass on these exact words to this body. We need more than a statement on a piece of paper. We need real action from the United Nations. That is why this session is so important. The UN and the international community look to this council for information, analysis, and guidance on grave human rights issues. It is why it is imperative for me to travel to Myanmar so that I can report to you the facts necessary to inform your decisions and recommendations. Earlier this week, I reiterated my request to Myanmar to conduct an urgent country visit in accordance with my mandate. This council, member states, and the Security Council must call in the strongest terms possible for my request to be accepted. The United Nations has demonstrated throughout its history a capacity to take action by tapping into the full range of the tools at its disposal or developing new ones when necessary. And of course, the Council's mandate gives it broad authority to make recommendations with regard to the promotion and protection of human rights. The Council may consider making such recommendations to the Security Council, the General Assembly, member states, and private enterprises. I urge you to do so. The UN Security Council should be encouraged to consider all of the options it has previously used to deal with gross human rights violations. Security Council resolutions dealing with similar situations have mandated targeted sanctions, arms embargoes, and travel bans, and have called for judicial action at the International Criminal Court or ad hoc tribunals. All of these options should be on the table. Barring concrete steps from the Security Council, the General Assembly can convene an emergency special session. During past emergency special sessions, the General Assembly has recommended actions ranging from ceasefires to arms embargoes to trade sanctions. Member states have the ability to act themselves, of course, and are beginning to do so. This week, the United States announced sanctions to target the military's financial pillars, and New Zealand imposed a travel ban on those responsible for this coup, while also ceasing diplomatic engagement. I urge other member states to take action from imposing targeted sanctions to bilateral arms embargoes to ensuring that assistance that they provide to the people of Myanmar goes to civil society organizations directly whenever possible, instead of through the junta. This council should encourage these steps. Private industry, meanwhile, has a responsibility to respect all internationally recognized human rights wherever they operate in accordance with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We have seen a growing list of international companies decide they will no longer do business with the junta. The Council should encourage all companies with ties to the military to suspend their relationships. Those that continue to stay engaged in Myanmar should conduct heightened human rights due diligence in meaningful consultation with all relevant stakeholders to avoid the risk of being complicit in gross human rights abuses. Private industry should also provide support to workers who may be impacted by the suspension of operations while supporting their right to oppose the coup. Madam President, I urge this body, the United Nations, and all member states to make at least 4 core demands of the military junta of Myanmar. That they release unconditionally all who have been detained. That they end the persecution and prosecution of the people of Myanmar for exercising their basic human rights. That they stand down immediately so that the duly elected government of Myanmar can begin its work. And that they return to their barracks and consent to fundamental reforms that will end the impunity of the Tatmadaw leadership while fully establishing accountability of the military to civilian control. Distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, this is a moment of great peril for the people of Myanmar. It is a moment of truth for all of us. As the people of Myanmar demonstrate their remarkable courage and resolve, let us demonstrate our support of them and the principles and values that they are fighting for. These are the principles and values that are the very foundation of this body, and they are under siege in Myanmar. Let us speak truth with clarity and force, and then let us act with and for a people in their hour of peril and need. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. We will now hear from the country concerned, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam President, at the outset, I wish to congratulate you for assuming the presidency of the Human Rights Council in 2021. I also wish to express our congratulations to members of the Bureau. Madam President, over the years, Myanmar has been nurturing democratic values, establishing peace and stability, and sustainable development to the benefit of the people. In our strenuous efforts to achieve democracy, national reconciliation, peace and development, we have been engaging constructively with the United Nations and international community. With this constructive spirit, Myanmar recently participated in the third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review on Myanmar at the 37th section of the UPR Working Group in Geneva on 25th January 2021. Madam President, in light of the post-election irregularities and following complex situation, Rapporteur was compelled to take the state responsibility in accordance with the state constitution. With the Ordinance Order 1/2021 on 1st February 2021, the state of the emergency was declared for 1 year, and the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the state were transferred by acting president to the Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces. The State Administration Council was formed on 2nd February 2021 with 16 members, including 8 senior military officials and 8 civilians. The Commander-in-Chief, Senior General May Online, served as the chairman of the council. Furthermore, the council reappointed the new chairman and new members of the Union Election Commission on 2nd February 2021. The council also retained the Myanmar National Human Rights Commission to continue their duties and responsibilities. Madam President, on 1st February 2021, the State Administration Council announced the following 5-point roadmap. 1, to carry out necessary measures, including reformation of the Union Election Commission and inspection of the voting list in accordance with the law. 2, to continue to implement preventive measures against COVID-19 pandemic with added momentum and effective ways. 3, to remedy the national economy impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic with feasible ways. 4, to attain lasting peace throughout the nation in line with the nationwide ceasefire agreement. And 5th, to convene a multi-party general election and hand over the state power to the winning party in line with the democratic norms. The State Administration Council reiterated to continue receiving displaced persons in Bangladesh in line with the bilateral agreement, as well as to resettle the internally displaced person from the ITP camps in an instant manner. The Council also committed to continue repatriating stranded Myanmar national abroad due to prevailing challenges related to COVID-19 pandemic. Madam President, Myanmar continues to adhere to the independent, active, and non-aligned foreign policy and uphold the principles of peaceful coexistence amongst nations. In our cooperation with the international and regional organizations, Myanmar will continue to cooperate with the United Nations, and our policy of cooperation will remain unchanged. On humanitarian aspect, Myanmar will extend her continued cooperation with the United Nations, ASEAN, WFP and ICRC and other development partners. Myanmar will continue to implement the Memorandum of Understanding signed between the Ministry of Labour, Immigration and Population and UNDP and UNHCR in Rakhine State. Myanmar will remain steadfast to perform her duties as a state party to the international treaties, including core human rights instruments and ILO conventions. Madam President, as a member of ASEAN, Myanmar will continue to uphold the purposes and principles enshrined in the ASEAN Charter and the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, TAC. Furthermore, Myanmar will continue to participate in the sub-regional cooperation mechanisms, including ACMEX, CLMV, and Mekong-based cooperation mechanism. Madam President, on the fight against COVID-19, Myanmar will continue to exert utmost efforts to overcome the health and socio-economic challenges and to mitigate the negative impact on the livelihood of the peoples. Myanmar will continue to work on the existing COVID-19 vaccination program and procure the vaccines through bilateral commercial arrangements and the COVAX facility. We will also closely cooperate with the WHO and Gavi to ensure access to COVID-19 vaccines to all communities within the country. Madam President, Myanmar is undergoing the extremely complex challenges and delicate transition. We do not want to stall our nascent democratic transition in the country. We therefore look forward to receiving better understanding on the prevailing situation in the country and constructive engagement and cooperation from the international community. Myanmar will continue to engage with the United Nations towards lasting peace, stability, and sustainable development to the benefit of the people in the country. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you, Excellency, for your statement. I now turn to the list of speakers. I would like to ask you to strictly respect the established time limit of 2 minutes and 30 seconds for council members and 1 minute and 30 seconds for observers. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal on behalf of the European Union for a video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. We welcome that the Human Rights Council addresses the grave political events in Myanmar, which reverse 10 years of democratic transition. We are deeply concerned about human rights implications. To remain silent about violations of fundamental human rights, such as freedoms of opinion and expression, religion or belief, association, assembly, and the media, is not an option. Thus, we requested this special session jointly with the UK. It is a crucial opportunity for the Council to prevent further human rights violations. The EU condemns in the strongest terms the military coup in Myanmar and all violations and abuses of human rights and fundamental freedoms. This illegitimate seizure of power abruptly turned back the clock of history. The path towards democracy began in 1011, was reversed and disrespected once again by the military resorting to violence against the population. The will of the people must be restored, human rights must be respected, violence prevented. Through the high turnout, people expressed their strong belief in the democratic process in the elections of 8 November. It was a milestone in the democratic transition. Any allegations of irregularities has to be settled within proper legal channels. Overturning the choice of the people by force is illegal and against democracy. The EU welcomes the press statement by the UN Security Council and fully supports the engagement of the UN Special Envoy. We welcome the statement by ASEAN and encourage regional engagement. The EU has been a supporter of Myanmar's civilian and democratic transition in its peace process and national reconciliation and inclusive socio-economic development. We call upon the military to immediately and without conditions release the president, the state councillor, and all arrested and detained, including journalists and human rights defenders. Ensure independent telecommunications, respect all human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. Immediately end the state of emergency, restore the legitimate civilian government, open the newly elected parliaments with all elected representatives, proceed with the elections of the president, vice presidents, and the appointments of the new government, end the use of force and guarantee the safety of all peaceful protesters in line with international law, ensure unfettered humanitarian access to all conflict-affected areas and communities. We stand ready to support dialogue with all key stakeholders to contribute to resolve the situation. Accountability must be ensured. The EU calls on Myanmar to fully implement the provisional measures following the ICC's order in the case lodged by the Gambia. The EU also notes the ICC's authorization of the prosecutor to investigate alleged crimes. The EU calls upon all states and entities, including private corporations, to offer their full cooperation to the independent investigative mechanism. Finally, we call on Myanmar to fully cooperate and provide full access to the Special Rapporteur, the independent investigative mechanism, and the Office of the High Commissioner, and ensure humanitarian access to all parts of the country.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Denmark. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madam President, Denmark aligns itself with the EU statement. I strongly condemn the coup in Myanmar. The election result must be respected, the democratically elected government reinstated, and Parliament reconvened. This Council must now contribute to prevent further serious violations of human rights and fundamental rights. I urge the military of Myanmar to uphold its responsibility to protect human rights, particularly to respect the human rights of peaceful demonstrators, their freedom of expression, and of peaceful assembly. I also call for unrestricted humanitarian access. Denmark will suspend all direct development cooperation with the now illegitimate government. But Denmark will continue to support the civil society of Myanmar. We must stand together to put pressure on the Myanmar military to uphold its human rights obligations, to release political leaders and civil society activists, and to ensure a return to democracy. We must stand together in solidarity with the people of Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for a video message from the Minister for Asia at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. The floor is yours.
Madam President, the United Kingdom condemns the military coup in Myanmar and the arbitrary detention of members of the democratically elected civilian government and civil society, including President Myint and State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. It's essential that Aung San Suu Kyi, Myint and all those arbitrarily detained are released. We must receive assurances of their safety and well-being. We stand with the people of Myanmar, who are now bravely exercising their democratic right to protest this coup. Their wishes and the results of the November 2020 general election must be respected. The human rights situation continues to deteriorate. We are extremely concerned by the reports and images of violence emerging from Myanmar perpetrated by the police and military. The state of emergency imposed by the military should be lifted immediately. All actors must refrain from violence and seek dialogues towards a peaceful resolution. We continue to closely monitor the situation and call on the military to refrain from obstructing the people's access to information and communication. The United Kingdom is clear that the state of emergency and all restrictions on the rights and freedoms of people in Myanmar must be lifted immediately. There must be unobstructed humanitarian access for international NGOs and civil society organisations so that essential aid can reach those that need it. The events of the past 2 weeks have shown that it is of the utmost importance that the Special Rapporteur continues to assess the situation of human rights and to provide regular updates. We call on the Secretary-General and High Commissioner for Human Rights to continue to give the Special Rapporteur their full support and press Myanmar to allow him access. We welcome the unanimous statement of the Security Council supporting Myanmar's democratic transition and the ASEAN Chair's statement, which recalls the principles of the ASEAN Charter, such as the rule of law, good governance and democracy. We encourage all partners to work constructively to prevent any further violence and seek a peaceful resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Germany for a video message.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. Germany condemns the seizure of power by the military in Myanmar in the strongest possible terms and is deeply concerned about the human rights implications. The overthrow of civilian rule and democracy blatantly ignores the will of the people of Myanmar, freely expressed during the November 2020 elections, and poses a serious risk of jeopardizing the country's effort to democratize during the past 10 years. The state of emergency must be lifted. All those arbitrarily detained must be released immediately, including legitimately elected political leaders, parliamentarians, human rights defenders, journalists, and activists. We appeal to the Myanmar military to refrain from all actions that lead to a further escalation, including the use of force against peaceful protesters. The grave situation in Myanmar demands an adequate response. Many options are on the table. At the same time, we should use the room for dialogue and diplomacy to involve all relevant stakeholders at the national level, in the region, and internationally. The alarming developments in Myanmar also require the urgent attention of the Human Rights Council. Together, we must speak up for the protection of all human rights, including the rights to freedom of assembly and to freedom of opinion and expression, both offline and online. We must also speak up for the prevention of violence, for the immediate release of all those detained, for allowing the democratically elected government to resume its work. The Human Rights Council must also ensure accountability for all current and future human rights violations. Germany welcomes the press statement by the UN Security Council and reiterates the Secretary-General's call for the military leadership to respect the outcome of the elections and fully support the engagement of the UN Special Envoy. We reaffirm our support for the civilian government's effort to promote peace, economic development and human rights in Myanmar. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and we will now hear statements from delegations who will be using the Zoom platform. I would like to inform delegations that if they feel comfortable with the Zoom platform, they are encouraged to move into the speakers room themselves. once I call their names, instead of waiting for the Secretariat to move them. And I understand that the Secretariat has included instructions on how to make this move in the chat box. So I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France, followed by Italy, followed by Indonesia. You have the floor. The distinguished representative of France. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. Thank you very much. France would like to thank the United Kingdom as well as the European Union for their initiative to organize this special session of the Human Rights Council, a special meeting to underline the mobilization of the international community in the aftermath of the coup d'etat of February 1st in Myanmar. We espouse the statement made by the European Union. France condemns the coup d'etat, and we remain quite concerned by the prevailing situation in Myanmar. As we did from February 1st, France calls yet again to the immediate freeing, without conditions, of all those that have been arbitrarily detained as part of the coup d'etat, including State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, President Myint, as well as all those elected during the elections of 8 November 2020. France once again asks for the state of emergency to be there to restore the power to democratically elected government, to respect human rights and the rule of law. The outcome of the general elections of November 8, 2020 must be respected, and the Parliament of Myanmar should meet as soon as possible. France recalls its commitment to the freedom of expression, including the freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of the press, and the personal safety of journalists, as well as all those who contribute to public debates in Myanmar or anywhere else in the world. Restrictions imposed by the army on the freedom of expression are most alarming. The population, the civilian population, mainly journalists, should not be subjected to any kind of reprisals. France also calls for unrestricted humanitarian access so that those most vulnerable can receive assistance. Last, France recalls the order of the International Court of Justice of January 23, 2020, in application of the Convention for the Prevention and the Repression of Crimes of Genocide of 1948. Thank you.
And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. Italy aligns itself with the EU statement. We welcome that the Human Rights Council addresses the events that are taking place in Myanmar through the special session. Italy strongly condemns the military coup in Myanmar as it abruptly overturned the electoral will of the citizens. The military regime must immediately and unconditionally release the President of the Republic, the State Councillor, and all those who have been unjustly arrested and detained. The state of emergency must end immediately. We ask the military to abide by the principles of democracy, rule of law, and good governance, granting the respect and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. In the 21st century, we cannot tolerate anymore the arrest of political leaders and civil society activists, the severe cut-off of civil liberties of citizens that peacefully exercise their right to demonstrate in support of the democratically elected government and parliament. We stand in solidarity with all of them and call on security forces to refrain from further violence or excessive use of force. Italy has always been committed to support Myanmar's democratic transition and national reconciliation process. We are not ready to accept the failure of these processes. This is why we call on regional and international partners to work together in the pursuit of a swift solution, and we stand ready to do our part. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia. The floor is yours.
Madam President, Indonesia has been supporting and will continue to support Myanmar's struggle toward democratic transition that is peaceful and upholds human rights. We are therefore deeply concerned over the recent political situation that has jeopardized this hard-fought gain. We call upon Myanmar to uphold the principle of democracy and constitutional government. The respect for fundamental freedom and human rights contained in the ASEAN Charter and ASEAN Human Rights Declaration should continue to be respected. Madam President, we still believe that the solution to the present situation lies in a Myanmar-led, Myanmar-owned process. Thus, all parties in Myanmar must exercise self-restraint and advance dialogue. The military and police should be an inclusive part of democratic transition. They bear the responsibility to guard human rights and democracy. Any restriction toward rights and freedom with a view to restore normalcy should be proportionate and lawful. The safety and protection of all people in Myanmar are at the utmost important. Madam President, this special session should, first, call on Myanmar to fulfill its national and international human rights obligations. This involves assisting Myanmar in strengthening democratic institutions and processes, including in settling election disputes and addressing the root causes of the current situation. Second, support ASEAN centrality and leading role in responding to the current development in Myanmar by reinforcing individual and collective effort of ASEAN member states. Furthermore, what is happening now should not distract us from creating conducive necessary for safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of displaced Rohingya and other minorities, ensuring that Myanmar works to respond to the pandemic and its consequences. To conclude, it is imperative for Myanmar to open their door to dialogue with ASEAN, countries in the region, and the United Nations. Only through dialogue, mutual understanding on how international community can assist Myanmar to address the present problem can be found. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea for a video message. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation expresses deep concern over the current situation in Myanmar after the military takeover. We are alarmed by reports that political leaders and civil society activists are being arbitrarily detained. We call for an immediate release of those arbitrarily detained, including State Councillor Do Aung San Suu Kyi, President Myint, and others. We pay attention to recent reports suggesting restrictions on not only access to internet and communication services, but also journalists and media workers. We urge the authorities of Myanmar to fully ensure freedom of expression, access to information, and the right to peaceful assembly. As a strong supporter of the democratic transition in Myanmar, the Korean government reaffirms its utmost respect for the Myanmar people's aspiration for democracy that was demonstrated in the general election last November. We hope that the issue will be resolved peacefully in adherence to a lawful and democratic process. In addition, the vulnerability of refugees and internally displaced persons should not be ignored in times like this. We emphasize the need for safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all people in need. Reiterating our support of the democratic transition and full respect for human rights, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its commitment to fully cooperate with the international community and the people of Myanmar to this end. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya by video message.
Thank you, Madam President. While we are following up with concern the situations in Myanmar and the security and political developments there, along with the grave violations of human rights that rise up to crimes against humanity, and while we observe non-concrete, non-transparent cooperation by the authorities in Myanmar with the international and United Nations recommendations to put an end to these human rights violations, as reported by the international commissions that documented the crimes, the untold crimes against minorities, crimes that are rejected by all religions. The recent violations do indeed affect human rights and the gender situation, as well as the human rights defenders, while it can be considered a grave development in the negative humanitarian situation against civilians, particularly Rohingyas. Madam President, situation in Myanmar is worsening, particularly against minorities, most notably against Rohingya Muslims who do not receive the minimum levels of justice, health and humanitarian care, particularly when COVID is spreading. We call upon this August Council and the international community to expeditiously take concrete measures to protect minorities and civilians, particularly Rohingyas, put an end to crimes of genocide, undertake comprehensive and fair investigations in all violations, ensure no impunity, finding sustainable solutions for internally displaced persons, while ensuring a safe return for Rohingyas to their home in Myanmar. We affirm that it is incumbent upon the international community to take concrete measures to address the root causes of the situation in Myanmar and all other situations in the world. And this must be a start at the level of the Council and the international community to undertake this role so that these crimes will not perpetuate. Thank you.
To Austria for a video message.
Thank you, Madam President. Austria strongly supported the convening of today's special session. At this moment of crisis, it is crucial to show the courageous people of Myanmar that the international community is watching, that they're not alone, and that we're willing to act to hold those who are responsible for this outrageous attack on their young and fragile democracy to account. Austria condemns the coup by the Tatmadaw in the strongest terms. It brings back painful memories of previous decades and is an unacceptable attempt by the military to overturn the will of the people of Myanmar, as clearly expressed in the general election. We urge the military leadership to adhere to the democratic process and the rule of law and call for the immediate restoration of the legitimate civilian government. To this end, we encourage to pursue dialogue and reconciliation in accordance with the interests of the people of Myanmar. We find it extremely worrying to hear that, according to latest information, at least 170 people, including political leaders, members of parliament, students, journalists, human rights defenders or artists, have been arbitrarily detained over the last days, and we call for their immediate and unconditional release. Deeply shocked about lethal incidents through live bullets fired at peaceful protesters, Austria urges the Myanmar authorities to display utmost restraint and refrain from using excessive force in all circumstances. We are also concerned by attempts of the authorities to restrain access to the internet or social media services, apparently to stifle the flow of public information. We therefore urge the authorities to guarantee the safety of all peaceful protesters, as well as the exercise of the Myanmar people's right to freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of expression and access to information. Madam President, dear colleagues, it is important that we, the international community, stand with the people of Myanmar in this critical hour, and we therefore call upon all delegations to support and join consensus on the draft resolution to be adopted at the end of this special session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to India for a video message.
Madam President, I thank you for giving me the floor. The recent developments in Myanmar are a matter of deep concern, as they will affect the progress of democracy in Myanmar. India has been steadfast in its support to the process of democratic transition in Myanmar. We have worked with all concerned to facilitate the establishment of multi-party democracy and a stable democratic federal union in Myanmar. An area of our focus has been capacity building, including courses on constitutional and federalism for political leaders and elected representatives. We believe that the progress achieved on the path to democracy over the last decade or so was impressive. Unfortunately, the hopes and aspirations of the people of Myanmar have been dealt a blow by the latest developments. We strongly believe that the rule of law and democratic processes must be upheld and the detained political leaders released. The right to protest peacefully is an integral part of the democratic ethos. Madam President, India shares a land and maritime border with Myanmar. We have direct stakes in the maintenance of peace and stability and the development of the country. Our project and capacity building based efforts in Myanmar have aimed at socio-economic development of the country. We propose to continue with our developmental efforts so that people on the ground do not suffer. Madam President, we call on the leadership of Myanmar to work together to resolve their differences in a peaceful and constructive manner. Restoring democratic order should be the priority of all stakeholders in Myanmar. The international community must lend its constructive support to the people of Myanmar at this critical juncture. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to the Czech Republic for a video message.
Madam President, the Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. Today's special session is being held because of the urgency and seriousness of the current developments in Myanmar and to examine the country's commitment to international human rights law. The Czech Republic strongly condemns the military coup and stands with the people of Myanmar. We remain supportive of the country's legitimate, democratically elected leadership and call for respect of last year's elections. So far, more than 170 persons have been detained and arrested, including President Myint, State Councillor Do Aung San Suu Kyi, one of the NLD leader of the Hain, members of the civil society such as Mya Aye, Min Twai Tit, Aung Myoko and Tu Han To, as well as monks, writers, journalists, media workers and human rights defenders. We call for their immediate and unconditional release. Human rights and fundamental freedoms must be respected and protected in Myanmar. Any use of force against people exercising their rights to peacefully protest and participate in public affairs across the country must be avoided. Attacks on journalists and representatives of the civil society, internet shutdowns and targeted blockage of social media are unacceptable and must be immediately and permanently ceased. We urge the military regime in Myanmar to listen to the international pleas, accept an internal offer for mediation, fully cooperate with all UN mechanisms, enable a safe humanitarian access, and above all, respond to the will of the people of Myanmar. The presented resolution offers a good way forward. It presents an opportunity to work together in a constructive manner. The Czech Republic and Myanmar have a long tradition of cooperation on the democratic transition that we can build upon. This is the moment. I thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Bulgaria for a video message.
Madam President, Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. Bulgaria is profoundly disturbed by the events in Myanmar following the unacceptable seizure of power by the military on February 1st, 2021. In view of the particular importance and urgency of the situation there, Bulgaria was among those members of the Human Rights Council that promptly supported the initiative to hold a special session of the Council on the human rights implications of the crisis in Myanmar. We condemn the military takeover, which has reversed the process of transition to peace, pluralism and national reconciliation in Myanmar. We are appalled by the arbitrary detention of the President, the State Councillor, other prominent political leaders, public figures, human rights defenders, journalists and activists. We denounce the imposed broad restrictions on media and public gatherings. We deplore the use by police of excessive and lethal force against protesting people in the capital Naypyidaw and other cities. Together with its partner states from the European Union, Bulgaria is strongly committed to the democratic transition, national reconciliation and accountability for human rights violations in Myanmar. Therefore, we underscore the need for restoration of the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as the rule of law in the country. creating conditions for the safe, voluntary, sustainable and dignified return of all refugees and internally displaced persons also is of key importance in this respect. We call for the unconditional release of the President Myint, State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and others who have been arbitrarily detained. Bulgaria urges for the end of the state of emergency, restoration of power of the legitimate civilian government and opening of the parliament with participation of all elected representatives. We call for the lifting of the curfew, restrictions on media and public gatherings. Bulgaria urges for immediate termination of the use of excessive and lethal force against protesting people in Myanmar. Finally, Bulgaria reiterates its call for granting UN special procedures and humanitarian organizations, including the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, unhindered and unrestricted access to the territory of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, and all delegations should be advised that the list of speakers is now closed. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation for a video message.
Madam President, the Russian Federation is keeping a close eye on the development events in Myanmar. We believe that settling disagreements between the political forces in Myanmar is a purely domestic affair of the sovereign state. We believe that attempts to place the latest events which are linked to the declaration of a state of emergency on the human rights plane is hardly justified and very political. We would like to point out that the transfer of power to the State Administrative Council did not lead to an overhaul of the legal and institutional framework for protecting and promoting human rights. Today, as before, in the country there is a constitution, and all constitutional norms regarding political and civil rights and freedoms remain in force. We note that the interim administration, through its first executive orders, confirmed the authority of the incumbent leaders and structures of the judiciary, as well as of the Myanmar National Commission on Human Rights and the Anti-Corruption Commission. Finally, the leadership of the State Administrative Council has committed itself to holding multi-party parliamentary elections and to transferring power to the legislative and executive authorities that would be formed as a result of the vote. We welcome the fact that officially Naypyidaw has reaffirmed its commitment to its international obligations, including in the field of the protection and promotion of human rights, and its endeavours to continue cooperating with the relevant UN organisations. Madam President, issues in the field of human rights need to be addressed with the state concerned through open dialogue and cooperation. Today's special session is clearly not conducive to that. Attempts to whip up hype around the situation in Myanmar need to cease. We are convinced that the core efforts of the international community need to be aimed not at unbridled criticism, but at providing practical assistance to the new authorities in Myanmar to fulfill their obligations, including in the field of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Poland for a video message.
Madam President, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement and would like to deliver comments in its national capacity. The situation unfolding in Myanmar calls for the utmost attention of the Human Rights Council. Poland deeply regrets that the state of emergency was imposed by the military, followed by arbitrary detention of democratically elected members of the government, human rights defenders, journalists and others who peacefully protest on the streets of Myanmar. In strongest terms, we condemn the use of violence against peaceful protesters exercising their fundamental rights. We call on the military to refrain from any further internet shutdowns and network disruptions that are in direct breach of international law and increase the atmosphere of fear in the country. Madam President, in November last year, the people of Myanmar expressed their will in the general elections. Yet the democratic transition of Myanmar is now in great jeopardy after the removal of democratically established government. Poland called for the legitimate government to be restored and the state of emergency ended. Poland stands in solidarity with the people of Myanmar, who are yearning for freedom and democracy and defend their basic human rights. We demand that the Myanmar military takes immediate steps to respect and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of religion or belief, as well as freedom of association and assembly in accordance with international human rights law. We further urge the Myanmar military
to fully cooperate with the established UN human rights mechanism to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained and to refrain from violence against peaceful protesters. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Brazil for a video message.
Madam High Commissioner, Madam President, distinguished delegates. The situation unfolding in Myanmar in the past 2 weeks raised deep concerns in all countries that cherish and uphold democratic values. Brazil regrets the imposition of the state of emergency on February 1st and calls for the immediate reinstatement of the legitimate government and the parliament elected by the people of Myanmar in November 2020. Brazil is concerned about the actions taken to suspend telecommunications and curb online freedoms, curtailing the ability of people to express their views and exchange ideas online is a serious assault on the right to freedom of speech and of the right to peaceful protest. We call on the immediate end to restrictions on the internet and telecommunication. In spite of the challenges on the ground, we have seen peaceful demonstrations taking place in Myanmar, and this is a testimony to the strong desire of the people to protect and safeguard their freedoms. We urge the Myanmar security forces to refrain from using violence against peaceful demonstrations. This past January, during Myanmar's UPR, Brazil recommended that the country's government strengthen policies and institutions to promote and protect the rights of minorities, particularly on the issue of displaced persons among the Rohingyas. The events that unfolded since February 1st aggravated our concerns regarding the rights of minorities and displaced persons. As a member of the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, Brazil calls for the full respect for the Rohingya refugees being repatriated to Myanmar. Brazil supported the proposal to convene this special session, and we will vote in favor of the resolution on the human rights implications of the crisis. We reiterate the calls by the international community for the prompt restoration of democratic order in Myanmar.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Namibia for a video message, and it will be followed by a statement from Bangladesh on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. Namibia commends the EU and the UK for their leadership, which has enabled us to convene, discuss and take appropriate action on the alarming prevailing situation in Myanmar, which is among other things marked by the removal of a democratically elected government, the detention of political leaders and activists, as well as restrictions of freedom of expression. Namibia is deeply concerned about reports regarding the use of lethal force by the Myanmar military against unarmed peaceful protesters, and we therefore join the international community by calling on the military to immediately and unconditionally release the political leaders and all other persons who have been arbitrarily detained. We further call on the Myanmar military to fully respect all human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. The military must exercise restraint in its response to ongoing protest. Madam President, we hope that the Human Rights Council, now more than ever, through its action later today, can in unity demonstrate that it is committed to promote respect for human rights in Myanmar. Namibia, as a member of this Human Rights Council, will play its part by supporting the request to enhance the monitoring and reporting mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Bangladesh remains a strong advocate for democracy and democratic values. We hope that the democratic process and the constitutional arrangements will be upheld in Myanmar. The restoration of peace and stability in Myanmar is not only vital for the country itself, but also for the other countries of our region. Madam President, we are concerned with the situation of human rights of the minority communities in Myanmar, including the Rohingyas, who have been facing decades of repression, discrimination, and persecution. We believe that full and effective implementation of the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State including the establishment of a clear pathway to citizenship of the Rohingyas, would be crucial to solve the lingering Rohingya issues. Equally important would be to ensure accountability and justice for the massive violations of human rights of the Rohingyas. We have been trying hard with Myanmar to commence repatriation of the forcibly displaced Rohingyas sheltered in Bangladesh to Myanmar in a safe, secure, and dignified manner. We expect that the process would be expedited in order to achieve a durable solution to this human rights and humanitarian crisis. The international community should assist us through their constructive engagement in the repatriation process. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Mexico by video message.
Thank you, Madam President. The government of Mexico would like to reiterate here that it is deeply concerned at the recent events in Myanmar, and we would like to echo the statements made by the UN Secretary General and the Security Council on the situation in the country. Mexico is convinced that democracy, the respect for human rights, the rule of law, and inclusive dialogue are the only ways to achieve peace and prosperity. We reject attempts to reverse democratic progress and to ignore the will of the people. Therefore, we firmly call on all Myanmar's political and social actors to resume dialogue through institutional channels as soon as possible. Similarly, we call for the immediate release of democratically elected civil leaders and for an inclusive and constructive dialogue to begin, anchored in the constitutional order. We also urge Myanmar's authorities to fully respect human rights, including the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. We also urge them to refrain from using force against peaceful demonstrators. The different bodies of the United Nations, including this Council, must continue to support the democratic transition in Myanmar and to contribute to the upholding of democratic institutions and processes. We trust that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar will, within their respective mandates, continue to monitor the situation and to report back to this Council regularly. We also urge the Myanmar authorities to cooperate in a committed manner with these and other international and regional human rights mechanisms and to grant them access to their territory. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Argentina by Zoom, followed by Venezuela by video message, followed by China by Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. Argentina would like to express its deep concern at the disruption of the institutional order in Myanmar and the negative impact this is having on human rights. From the recent arbitrary detentions of political leaders, members of parliament, human rights advocates, journalists, activists and others, to the restrictions placed on information and freedom of expression, including internet and social networks, and restrictions on the right to peaceful assembly, amongst other things. We call for the results of the elections of the 8th of November to be respected, for those who have been arbitrarily detained to be released, and for the constitutional order, the rule of law, and democratic institutions in Myanmar to be respected. We also urge Myanmar's military leaders to fully abide by international human rights law and to refrain from any unnecessary or excessive use of force. We also urge them to cooperate in a constructive fashion with the human rights protection mechanisms established by this Council. Finally, we urge the international community to monitor the situation that Myanmar is going through in these difficult times. And as the High Commissioner for Human Rights recently said, we need to avoid the fragile democratic progress and human rights achievements by Myanmar from being rolled back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Madam President. Once more, we have to take part in a special session of this council convened by some delegations against a country of the Global South. We regret that the situation that the Republic of Myanmar is currently living through is as it is, but without going into any valued judgments, we're concerned that the draft resolution put forward by the sponsors of this special session contains unverified information, including allegations which have not been fully verified. The sources have not been verified, and therefore that creates doubt and uncertainty. Generally, and over and beyond the ends pursued by this extraordinary mechanism of the Council, some of the states interested in organising these special sessions are continuing their attempt to politicise the work of the Human Rights Council. Venezuela is a peace-loving country, and we are committed to international solidarity and cooperation, and we will continue to oppose any initiatives that undermine the fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Therefore, we will continue to defend respect for sovereignty, integrity, independence, and non-interference in the internal affairs of states, as well as the free exercise of the right to self-determination by people. Madam President, we call for dialogue and understanding for the rights of all the citizens of Myanmar. We call for political stability within the country and the region. That is why it is important to build solidarity, trust, international commitment in accordance with the decisions taken by Myanmar. We believe that Myanmar will place the aspirations and in best interests of its people first, and will navigate its differences through dialogue within the legal framework that is in place, thus safeguarding political and social stability within the country. We would like to support any initiative that contributes to lasting peace and security in Myanmar and efforts aimed at finding a political solution that will lead to national reconciliation there. We are convinced that political dialogue is the only way for solving disputes, and that the people of Myanmar, as a sovereign people and with the support of the international community, needs to overcome the difficulties. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to China on Zoom, followed by Japan on Zoom, followed by Nepal on Zoom. The floor is yours, China.
Madam President, China maintains a consistent and well-known position regarding country-specific human rights issues. Based on this position, China is not in favor of holding this special session by the Human Rights Council. What happened in Myanmar is essentially Myanmar's internal affairs. What is urgently required now is for the international community, on the basis of respecting Myanmar's sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, and national unity, help all parties concerned in Myanmar to engage in dialogue and reconciliation in accordance with the wishes and the interests of the Myanmar people, and support the ASEAN, the UN Secretary-General's Special Envoy on Myanmar and his office in their mediation efforts. The President's press statement issued recently by the Security Council reflects this spirit. The actions of the Human Rights Council should also contribute to Myanmar's political and social stability and help solve the key problems rather than intensify conflicts and further complicate the situation. As a friendly neighbor, China hopes that all parties in Myanmar will put the will and the interest of the Myanmar people at first, properly handle differences within the constitutional and legal framework through dialogue, and maintain political and social stability. China is in contact and communication with relevant parties in Myanmar to promote the relaxation and the return to normal of the situation. We also welcome and support regional countries and ASEAN to make positive contributions to this end. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Japan.
Madam President,
Japan has consistently supported the process of democratization in Myanmar. Japan has grave concerns over the seizure of power by the military on February 1st and the detention of the democratically elected president. This goes against the process of democratization. Japan is also seriously concerned about the rising political tensions and strongly urges the military and other security forces to immediately halt the use of force and other violent acts against the public. Japan also strongly urges the Myanmar military to release all those detained, including State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, and immediately restore the democratic political system. Japan strongly hopes the government democratically elected by the people of Myanmar will be swiftly reinstated. In this regard, Japan will continue to proactively and constructively engage in towards the improvement of human rights and humanitarian situation in Myanmar in close cooperation with the international community. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Nepal. Nepal, you have the floor.
President.
Yes, Ambassador, we can see you and we can hear you.
Thank you. Madam President, we appreciate for the arrangements made for convening this special session. Nepal has been closely following the recent developments in Myanmar. Safety and well-being of detained civilian leaders, including President Myint and State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, is a matter of concern. We call for their immediate release. Being a country upholding the principles and values of democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, Nepal strongly encourages all parties in Myanmar to respect the will and the constitutional rights of its people, and also to create an environment conducive to addressing their differences through dialogue and reconciliation. We call upon Myanmar to restore democratic and constitutional process at the earliest. I thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to the Netherlands for a video message.
Madam President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and wishes to add the following comments on a national basis. On the 8th of November 2020, the people of Myanmar overwhelmingly voted in favor of the country's nascent democracy and not for the return of military rule. The dramatic turn of events on the 1st of February reverses Myanmar's path towards democracy less than a decade after the country began to steer away from half a century of military rule. The Netherlands strongly condemns the military coup and the state of emergency declared by the Myanmar armed forces and calls upon the military to restore the civilian government and act with a maximum restraint towards the peaceful protesters. The Netherlands is deeply concerned about the more than 170 arbitrary arrests of democratically elected politicians, human rights defenders, local and foreign advisors, and civil society representatives. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those who have been detained. The Netherlands is also deeply concerned about restrictions on freedom of expression, press freedom and access to information, including the social media ban and the proposed cybersecurity bill. The people of Myanmar cannot be excluded from shaping and sharing thoughts about the future of their country, and journalists should be able to work without fear of reprisals, intimidation or attack. Justice for victims and holding perpetrators of international crimes accountable remains crucial. The Netherlands recalls the ICJ Provisional Measures Order and the ongoing ICC investigation and calls on Myanmar to ensure unfettered access and cooperation with the Special Rapporteur and the IIMM. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Sudan on Zoom, followed by Marshall Islands and Ukraine, also on Zoom. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank the delegations of the United Kingdom and the European Union for their initiative to convene this special session of the Human Rights Council to discuss the consequences of human rights crisis in Myanmar. We also wish to thank all the member states in the Council for their understanding of these extraordinary circumstances that led us to hold this virtual session. Madam President, we join the delegations that expressed deep concerns over the manner with which the army took over power in Myanmar. We also join the calls within and without Myanmar to release the President, Myint, and the State Council, Aung San Suu Kyi, and all the political activists and leaders who were detained on the 1st of February. We call upon the authorities in Myanmar to stop using excessive force against peaceful protesters, to release detainees and restore full internet services. Madam President, Myanmar has seen a relative period of political stability in its pursuit to democratic transition and civil state that prevails where human rights principles prevail. Regrettably, this political regression takes place where the whole world is looking forward and is encouraging more experiences of successful democratic transition. It is noteworthy that my country is going through a great democratic transition at present on the back of a grand revolution where the will of the people emerged victorious, the will of the people who were calling for freedom, peace, and justice. Madam President, the international community in these challenging circumstances faced by Myanmar must not turn a deaf ear to the continued suffering of the Muslims, the Rohingya Muslims, for more than 8 years. The international community has to take all the necessary measures to ensure the safety of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. And thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Marshall Islands.
Marshall Islands, if you could unmute.
Madam President, the Marshall Islands welcomes the convening of this special session and is deeply concerned about the continuously deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar, in particular following the overthrow of the civilian government on February 1st. We are also alarmed by the reports of arbitrary detentions and violence against protesters, human rights defenders, and lawyers. We therefore echo the call made upon the military and other relevant authorities in HRC Resolution 42/3 to immediately end all violence and violations of international law, including against the Rohingya and other minorities, and to take all measures necessary to ensure full accountability of all actors and provide justice to victims. Additionally, we urge the international community to lend support to the refugees fleeing to serious human rights violations in Myanmar, as well as the host nation of Bangladesh, which has been shouldering that burden for over 3 years now. Finally, the Marshall Islands supports the call to grant full access to the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Myanmar. Komodada, and I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ukraine. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Madam President, Ukraine is deeply concerned about the situation in Myanmar in the wake of overturn of a democratically elected civilian government. Detention of the political leaders, human rights defenders, and media workers, as well as imposition of the state of emergency, are alarming. We call for the return to the rule of law and respect for human rights in Myanmar. We regret disturbing reports of reprisal and crackdown on the civil society, as well as shutting the communication networks and internet connectivity. We urge the Myanmar military to respect country's international human rights obligations, including freedom of opinion and expression, association and peaceful assembly, and call for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained, refrain from the use of force against peaceful protesters, and instantaneous lift of restrictions on the internet and social media. We echo the UN Secretary General's call on all leaders to act in the greater interest of Myanmar's democratic reform, engaging in meaningful dialogue, refraining from violence, and fully respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Ukraine stands in solidarity with the people of Myanmar in the pursuit of democracy, peace, human rights, and the rule of law. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Philippines for a video message, followed by Eritrea on Zoom, followed by the United Kingdom on Zoom. I give the floor to the Philippines for video message.
Madam President, the Philippines has been supportive of Myanmar's progress towards a fuller democracy, cognizant of the Army's role in preserving its territorial integrity and national security, as well as the unifying role of Daw Aung Suu Kyi in the history of the country and army her father founded. The lady is a deeply and widely admired icon of democracy among the Filipino people, who identify with her and her people, given similar struggles against tyranny in the not-too-distant past. Struggles that culminated in the complete restoration of democracy by unprecedented and entirely domestic efforts that inspired similarly successful efforts in the rest of the Cold War world. It has called for the complete restoration of the status quo ante, on which the full realization of this democratic process can only be achieved. Myanmar made important strides towards democratization in the past decade with the political presence of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, constitutional constraints on her political role notwithstanding. This was clear in Myanmar's engagement in the Universal Periodic Review last month. The Philippines will settle for nothing less than and nothing else but the complete restoration of the status quo in which Myanmar had made so much progress. As a sovereign country in a world of sovereign states, the Philippines cannot stress strongly enough the primacy of national internal efforts towards democratic reforms, and never by the imposition of foreign solutions, whether in regional or multilateral contexts, including through this Council. We reaffirm our support of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Myanmar. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Eritrea. The floor is yours.
Eritrea, you can start.
Eritrea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I was in fact asking to withdraw my statement at this juncture, but still I will make some comments. Eritrea remains somehow concerned by the situation, but this is really an election issue that we do not want to involve ourselves in. It is well established that we consider the situation in Myanmar, and that is a commitment that we have already reflected in our previous ordinary sessions, and we would love to have it this session on ordinary session that will be discussed within the Council. This way of having these special sessions is not supported by Eritrea, but we will still consider the situation in general as a grave, and the way it will be handled should be something that should be negotiated within the national institutions. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I understand the United Kingdom is not yet ready for the floor, so I give the floor to Pakistan on Zoom. Ambassador, we can't hear you. Could you just check if you have switched your mute button on? We can see you, but we can't hear you. Yes, please proceed, Ambassador.
Please go ahead. Pakistan. You may go ahead, Pakistan.
Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Ambassador. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. Pakistan continues to follow the situation in Myanmar and its human rights consequences on Rohingya Muslims with concern. We urge all parties involved to exercise restraint, uphold the rule of law, and work towards an early return to democratic setup. It is important to respect the aspirations of the people of Myanmar, especially the Rohingya Muslims. We support the role of regional organizations, especially ASEAN, in facilitating the reconciliation process in the country. Madam President, Pakistan has consistently called for dialogue and engagement to address human rights concerns. We have always advocated ownership of the country concerned in promoting and upholding respect for rights and freedoms. Even as we underscore these principles, we are concerned over the sustained pattern of systematic and continued violations of human rights, as is evident in the case of Rohingya Muslims. We are deeply concerned over the risks of the recent political crisis aggravating the already precarious situation for the Rohingya Muslims. A meaningful national dialogue and reconciliation is critical to addressing the systemic discrimination against Rohingya Muslims and other minorities. The safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of displaced persons, including the Rohingya Muslims, to their homeland is also a priority area. We call for an end to years of organized violence, hate speech, and intimidation against them. The fundamental rights, including the voting rights and right to citizenship of the Rohingya Muslim, must be granted without delay. This Council and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation have repeatedly called for ensuring the fundamental rights of Rohingya Muslims, including self-identification, by reviewing the discriminatory citizenship law. We reaffirm the urgency of these calls. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now turn to observers of the Human Rights Council, and I give the floor to Canada. You have the floor. I'm sorry, the distinguished representative of Canada, we cannot hear you in the room. If you just give us a minute to fix this, please.
Yes, Canada, you can go ahead.
Yes. Please proceed. And if you could start from the beginning again. Thank you. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you. Condemns in the strongest possible terms the military coup in Myanmar and the detention of the president, state councillor, senior civilian government leaders, and journalists and civil society representatives across the country. We reject the military's baseless claims of large-scale election fraud, which have been used as the pretense for a complete seizure of power from the democratically elected civilian government. The military's actions demonstrate blatant disregard for the will of Myanmar's people and risk further damaging decades of hard-earned civil and political rights, as well as the progress made towards inclusive democracy and peace. We are already seeing a rollback of civil rights, including attempts to restrict the mobilization of peaceful protests through the use of partial and complete internet and social media shutdowns. Canada calls on the military to remove all restrictions on civic space online, uphold the rights of peaceful assembly and freedoms of association and expression, and refrain from all forms of violence against peaceful protesters. We also call for unrestricted humanitarian access to support the most vulnerable, including the Rohingya and other conflict-affected populations. The military must release all detainees and restore the democratically elected government. Human rights defenders and others exercising their rights must be protected. Canada stands with the people of Myanmar who continue to strive towards long-lasting peace and inclusive democracy. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Sierra Leone on Zoom.
Madam President.
Please proceed. We can see you and we can hear you. Please proceed.
Madam President, Sierra Leone welcomes the convening of the special session on the human rights implications of the crisis in Myanmar and thanks the European Union and the United Kingdom for the initiative. The general election on 8th of November 2020 marked an important milestone in Myanmar's democratic transition, and the people of Myanmar expressed their will and strong belief in the democratic process. It is against this background that Sierra Leone condemns in the strongest possible terms the military coup of 1st of February 2020. My delegation strongly condemns the arbitrary detention of the democratically elected members of the government, including President Myint and State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, political leaders, human rights defenders, journalists, media workers, foreign experts, and others. We call upon the military to immediately and without conditions release the president, the state councillor, and all persons detained following the military coup and restore the civilian rule. Madam President, Sierra Leone believes that this special session is timely and consistent with the mandate of the Council in preventing human rights violations and responding promptly to human rights emergencies, as expressed in Resolution 4531 of 7 October 2020, which my delegation co-sponsored. Sierra Leone therefore strongly encourages dialogue and reconciliation among all stakeholders and the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of all displaced persons, including the Rohingya and other minorities. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Ireland for a video message.
Madam President, Ireland aligns with the EU statement. We welcome this special session on the coup in Myanmar and the urgent human rights situation in the country. Ireland strongly condemns the actions of the Myanmar military and the unlawful detention of political leaders, human rights defenders, journalists, and activists. We call for their immediate release. The people of Myanmar have voted for a democratic future. It is essential now that all parties demonstrate full respect for the results of the democratic elections held in November 2020. The security forces must respect freedom of association and freedom of expression and the right of the people of Myanmar to protest peacefully. We further call for meaningful engagement by all parties for the extension of existing ceasefires within Myanmar so that the important steps taken towards sustainable peace and national reconciliation are not undermined. The actions since the 1st of February have increased pressure on people already in vulnerable situations, including the Rohingya and other minority populations. It is essential that vital supply lines for humanitarian assistance remain open and that there is unimpeded access for humanitarian aid to people in need across Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Norway for a video message.
President, we welcome the opportunity to discuss this urgent matter. Norway strongly condemns the military coup in Myanmar. We call for the immediate release of detained members of the democratically elected civilian government, members of civil society, and human rights defenders. We are deeply concerned about limitations placed on internet and media access in Myanmar. Freedom of expression and media freedom are fundamental rights in themselves and also prerequisites for uncovering human rights violations. Journalists detained in the wake of the coup must be released. We strongly urge the authorities to cease all interference in the work of journalists. We call on the authorities in Myanmar to ensure the full protection of all civilians without discrimination. The rights of ethnic and religious minorities, including the Rohingya people and other internally displaced persons, must be protected. We strongly urge the military to refrain from violence and ensure people's right to assembly and peaceful protest. Norway continues to stand by the people of Myanmar in their aspirations for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Botswana for a video message.
Madam President, today marks the third history of this Council that a special session has been convened specifically to address the human rights situation in Myanmar. The violations still relate to the rights of citizens to freely choose their elected representatives, their right to freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly and association. Botswana notes with great concern this deteriorating human rights situation and urges Myanmar to fully cooperate with the relevant agencies to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to all people who may need it, including in the Rakhine State. We strongly urge security forces to refrain from perpetrating any form of acts of systematic, targeted, and deliberate human rights violations and abuses. We hold the view that democratic values, including the right to vote, the rule of law, and good governance, are sacrosanct, and we will speak against their violation as happened in Myanmar on the 1st of February 2021, when the military seized power despite a democratically chosen government being in place. We note with concern reports of arbitrary arrest of high-level politicians and protesters, enforced disappearances, restrictions on the work of civil society and journalists, media platforms, including internet and social media. As the global body mandated with the responsibility for the protection of human rights, we must act with the agency that this crisis deserves through the outcome resolution that we will adopt later today. The international community must ensure that when the situation normalizes, we strengthen efforts toward rebuilding democratic institutions and values in Myanmar to avoid the recurrence of such unacceptable events. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Malaysia for a video message.
Madam President, Malaysia continues to follow closely the developments in Myanmar. Malaysia calls on all parties to give utmost priority to the maintenance of peace and security. We reaffirm our strong support for Myanmar's democratic transition, peace process, and inclusive economic development. We call on all parties to uphold and respect democratic institutions and processes, the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, including the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. We urge all parties in Myanmar to exercise self-restraint and resolve their disagreement in a peaceful manner through dialogue and established legal mechanisms. Malaysia supports efforts to reconcile the differences among Myanmar's leaders to avoid adverse consequences to the people and the state of Myanmar. Malaysia sincerely hopes that an amicable solution that upholds the will and aspiration of the people will be pursued promptly. Malaysia will continue to play a constructive role to ensure peace, stability, and prosperity of ASEAN, which are essential for the region's progress. Thus, Malaysia and Indonesia have agreed to pursue an ASEAN meeting to engage constructively with Myanmar. Malaysia calls on Myanmar to remain resolute in delivering its commitment to begin and ensure effective repatriation of the displaced Rohingyas and protect their human rights. The international community must continue to support all efforts towards their safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable repatriation. The full version of this statement is on Extranet. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Lithuania for a video message.
Thank you, Madam President. Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement. We strongly condemn the recent military coup in Myanmar and the arbitrary detention of the Myanmar State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, President Myint, elected lawmakers, officials, and activists. Lithuania calls upon the Myanmar military leadership to end the state of emergency, to restore power to the legitimate civilian government, to release all those arbitrarily detained, to stop violence against demonstrators, and fully respect and protect human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. People of Myanmar must not be subject to repressions. Lithuania is particularly concerned about the restrictions on information flows, including internet shutdown, targeting of the media, and journalist harassment. We urge Myanmar to fully cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms, including Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar and IIMM. Lithuania welcomes the timely convocation of this special session and supports the draft Council resolution on human rights implications of the crisis in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ecuador by Zoom.
Thank you, President. My delegation would like to thank the Deputy High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur for their reports on the crisis in Myanmar. Ecuador, consistent with its permanent stance defending democracy and human rights, condemns the coup d'etat in Myanmar and deplores the arbitrary detention of political leaders, activists, human rights defenders, journalists inter alia, as well as the violent acts which are an assault against the rights of freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of association and peaceful assembly, religion or belief. In addition, we express our deep concern at the declaration of a state of emergency imposed by the Myanmar army, as well as the excessive use of force against demonstrators and restrictions when it comes to access to humanitarian assistance. Ecuador would also join the appeal that security forces of Myanmar fully respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Finally, we really hope that there will be a peaceful settlement to this crisis through dialogue, which will mean there will be return to the rule of law and reconciliation between the various actors in a framework characterised by unrestricted respect for human rights as well as democratic norms and standards. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Estonia by video message.
Madam President, Estonia strongly condemns the coup in Myanmar and the unlawful detention of State Councillor Do Aung San Suu Kyi, President U Win Myint, and other political leaders. All those detained should be released immediately and unconditionally. The Myanmar people have chosen democracy, and their strong belief in democratic processes was reconfirmed at the recent elections. The sudden turn of developments is very regrettable. We urge the military, Tatmadaw, to respect the 2008 constitution and the people's choice and to allow the National Assembly to reconvene peacefully with all its elected members. We urge all armed forces in Myanmar to cease fighting and recommit to the peace process. Any differences must be resolved through peaceful dialogue. The international community must use its leverage to avoid violence and crushing of peaceful protests. We are deeply troubled by and condemn the restrictions on use of internet and social media, as these undermine human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association and expression that form the basis of a democratic society. It is also important to ensure that the basic needs of the most vulnerable groups, including ethnic minorities, will not be further compromised due to the coup. Safe, voluntary and dignified return of Rohingya refugees to their place of origin has to remain a point of concern for the international community. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Slovenia by video message.
Madam President, Slovenia aligns with the EU statement. Slovenia is deeply concerned by the situation in Myanmar following the general elections on 8 November 2020, which marked an important milestone in the democratic transition of the country despite current health and security challenges. We strongly condemn the military coup and the removal of the civilian government elected by the people of Myanmar. We are concerned by the detention of political leaders and elected officials, including the President, the State Councillor, human rights defenders, journalists, and others. The military should refrain from using any unnecessary or excessive force against peaceful protesters and ensure that members of civil society organizations and the media operate freely and without fear of reprisal. Justice and accountability in respect of alleged crimes must be preserved. We call to restore telecommunications and refrain from imposing any further restrictions. We call on military to end the state of emergency, restore power to democratically elected government, and immediately and unconditionally release all detained. In conclusion, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all people in need must be ensured. We call for full cooperation with and the granting of full unrestricted access to UN mandate holders and human rights mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Romania by video message.
Madam President, Romania welcomes the convening of this special session and fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. The Human Rights Council cannot and will not remain silent in front of the troubling events in Myanmar. Human rights violations require urgent reactions and democratic transition must be restored. We are deeply concerned about the military coup in Myanmar, which we strongly condemn. We stand with the people of Myanmar in their quest for democracy, respect for democratic elections, fundamental freedoms and the rule of law. We further underline the call to return to constitutional order, as well as the need for accountability for past and ongoing human rights violations. We call upon the military to refrain from violence, to restore civilian government, to allow the democratically elected parliament to convene, and urge for a thorough consideration of all available options to restore democratic processes and institutions. Government officials and civil society activists should be immediately and unconditionally released. In its current capacity as chairman of the Community of Democracies, Romania emphasizes the need to uphold and defend democracy all over the world, especially in places such as Myanmar, where it has come under siege. Based on the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Romania will work for joint international action to ensure that democracy and democratic values prevail. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Sweden for a video message.
Thank you, Madam President.
Sweden welcomes this opportunity to address the crisis in Myanmar through a special session. Sweden is gravely concerned about the declaration of the state of emergency imposed by the military in Myanmar. Sweden calls on the military to respect the will of the people as manifested in the elections held on November 8. The legitimate civilian government must be immediately restored. All those arbitrarily detained, including members of government, human rights defenders, journalists, and others, must be released immediately and without conditions. The people of Myanmar, including civil society, human rights defenders, and journalists, ought not to be silenced. The right to freedom of opinion and expression online, as well as offline, must be guaranteed. Violence, intimidation, and harassment of those exercising their rights to peaceful assembly must stop, and the military should refrain from using excessive force. Serious human rights violations and abuses for which impunity still persists have been committed in Myanmar. Human rights monitoring and reporting of the situation is key. The UN Special Rapporteur must be ensured access to the country. The international community cannot allow a military coup to be a stepping stone for renewed violence in Myanmar. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Greece for a video message.
Madam President, Greece aligns itself with the EU statement and would like to add the following on its national capacity. During the recent UPR, Greece reiterated its serious concern regarding the grave human rights violations in Myanmar. We noted, however, the progress achieved in the democratic transition. The February 1st coup marked a backsliding in this respect, making the holding of this special session both timely and necessary. Greece calls for the will of the people of Myanmar, as expressed in the November elections, to be respected. We deplore the arbitrary detention of members of the government, political leaders, human rights defenders, journalists, activists, and others, and call for their immediate release. We also call for the respect of the fundamental rights and freedoms of the people of Myanmar, including their freedom of opinion and expression of assembly and association. The state of emergency, as well as restrictions on the internet, telecommunication, and social media, must be lifted. Madam President, as we call for the resumption of the democratization process, we must not forget that Myanmar's ability and willingness to address its past and present remain of critical importance. Credible accountability procedures for the serious human rights violations and abuses committed in the country constitute a necessary foundation to building a better future for all of its people. The ongoing processes in the ICJ and the ICC, as well as the IMM, are of vital importance.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Israel for a video message.
Thank you, Madam President. Israel welcomes the call by the United Kingdom and European Union for this special session to discuss the human rights implication of the crisis in Myanmar. We are closely following the situation after the declaration of the state of emergency imposed by the military on February 1st and support holding this meeting today. Madam President, we are deeply concerned by the detention of democratically elected members of the government, including head of state Aung San Suu Kyi and President Myint, and call for their urgent release. We are further concerned with the restrictions on civil society, including restrictions on the internet, telecommunications, and social media. Israel continues to be concerned about the ongoing situation of the Rohingya, and we look forward to a solution to their plight. Madam President, Israel will continue to support the people of Myanmar and the process of democratization. We call for the preservation of peace and the rule of law in the country and for the prevention of all violence. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Belarus by video message.
Madam President, we would like to express our concern with the trend of proliferation of country resolutions in the UN Human Rights Council. We believe that a number of questions raised during the current discussion falls outside the mandate of the Human Rights Council and thus creates a negative precedent for the future. The Human Rights Council uses the same instruments to react to the crisis situations in the area of human rights that we believe are mostly based on politics than real substance. We believe that throughout the multiplication of country resolutions, it will be impossible to overcome crisis situations, including in Myanmar, without real political diplomatic efforts and negotiations involving all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Holy See by video message, followed by New Zealand by Zoom.
Madam President, in these days, the Holy See has been following with great attention and deep concern the developments of the situation that has come about in Myanmar, a country that since the time of his apostolic visit in 2017, Pope Francis has carried in his heart with so much affection. In this most delicate moment, the Holy See wishes to assure once again its spiritual closeness, prayer and solidarity with the people of Myanmar. The Holy See also implores that those who hold responsibility in the country will place themselves and their actions with sincere willingness at the service of the common good, of fundamental human and civil rights, of promoting social justice and national stability for a harmonious, democratic and peaceful coexistence. The Holy See invites everyone to put aside all that stands in the way of the indispensable process of dialogue and mutual respect of human dignity. The Holy See is hoping for a peaceful and swift resolution to the ongoing tensions, remains confident that further dialogue may bring about so much desired peace. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to New Zealand by Zoom.
Madam President, please accept New Zealand's congratulations on the assumption of your role. New Zealand welcomes this special session of the Human Rights Council. We share the international community's deep concerns about the military intervention and impact on the human rights situation and peace process in Myanmar. New Zealand condemns the military coup in Myanmar and calls for the immediate return to civilian government. As a strong supporter of the rule of law and democratic process, New Zealand rejects the Tatmadaw Daw's actions and calls for the democratic will of the people in Myanmar to be respected. New Zealand also calls for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained by the military, including political and civil society leaders, democracy activists, journalists, and advisors, some of whom are also foreign nationals. New Zealand is deeply concerned about the implications of the military coup on the civil and political rights of the people of Myanmar. Military interference does not have a place in democratic processes or governance, and New Zealand takes this opportunity to reaffirm that civil and political rights such as freedom of expression and the right to peaceful demonstration must be protected. New Zealand calls on Myanmar to uphold these international human rights obligations by allowing the people of Myanmar the right to peacefully protest, and by ensuring a safe environment to exercise these rights free from intimidation and violence. New Zealand welcomes the Council's attention to this issue and joins in encouraging Myanmar to work with the international community to address these concerns. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Belgium by video message.
Madam President, Belgium strongly condemns the coup, the military coup in Myanmar. This involved intolerable acts of violence, including many arrests of representatives, elected representatives and members of civil society. We deplore the threats and physical violence against journalists and human rights defenders. My country urges the military forces to immediately and unconditionally release people who have been detained arbitrarily. We call for respect for human rights, the rule of law, and preserving institutions and democratic process. In order to achieve this, maintaining dialogue between all stakeholders in the country is of primordial importance. Belgium recalls that pursuant to international obligations, Myanmar has to respect the right for peaceful demonstration and needs to open up a space to dissident voices, we would call the military forces to refrain from all use of force against people and respect the rights of ethnic and religious minorities. Belgium would also ask for removal of restrictions on information and access to information, or establishing access to internet and social networks. Finally, we call on Myanmar to guarantee unlimited humanitarian access to peoples in need, as well as independent access to the country for OHCHR and also for the Special Rapporteur for Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United States of America for a video message, followed by Singapore, followed by Liechtenstein. Singapore and Liechtenstein will speak on Zoom. The United States of America.
Thank you, Madam President. The United States condemns the military's February 1 coup against the democratically elected government of Myanmar. We stand with the people of Myanmar in calling for the immediate restoration of the country's democratic institutions. We ask all council members to join the United States and others to 1. Urge the military to immediately release all those unjustly detained, including politicians, civil society representatives, journalists, foreign nationals, and human rights defenders. 2. Urge the military and police to restore power to the democratically elected government, demonstrate respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and refrain from further violence against peaceful protesters. 3. Urge the military to lift all restrictions on access to information, including by maintaining telecommunications and internet access. 4. Join us in promoting accountability for those responsible for the coup, including through targeted sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Singapore by Zoom.
Madam President, Singapore expresses grave concern about the latest situation in Myanmar. We are monitoring the situation closely and hope all parties involved will exercise restraint, maintain dialogue, and work towards a positive and peaceful outcome. Myanmar is a close friend of Singapore and key member of ASEAN. We hope that the situation will return to normal as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Liechtenstein on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. Liechtenstein thanks the United Kingdom and the EU for the request for a special session on the situation in Myanmar. We are deeply concerned about the removal of the civilian government by the military and the arbitrary arrest of democratically elected members of the government, including State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint, other political leaders, human rights defenders, journalists, media workers, activists, foreign experts, and others. We regret that the military of Myanmar has chosen to disregard the people's will as expressed in the elections of November 2020. The declaration of the state of emergency is as unacceptable as the internet shutdowns or the unwillingness of the leaders of Myanmar to uphold their human rights obligations. In light of the serious pre-existing human rights crisis in Myanmar, the military coup represents a clear danger of additional escalation. Madam President, in a situation of such gravity, the active involvement of the intergovernmental bodies is required. Liechtenstein supports the resolution to be adopted by the end of this special session and calls upon the Myanmar military to immediately lift the state of emergency, release arbitrarily detained persons, allow fair, independent investigations into all human rights violations, and cooperate with the OHCHR, as well as with Human Rights Council and its mandate holder. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Malta by video message, followed by Lao People's Democratic Republic by Zoom.
Madam President, Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Malta deplores the removal of the democratically elected government carried out by the Myanmar military on 1st February 2021. We are deeply concerned by the detention of political leaders and civil society activists, including State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint, and call for their unconditional release. Civilians, including civil society and journalists, must not be subject to reprisals of any form. Additionally, restrictions on the internet and social media must be permanently lifted immediately. We also call for safe, and unrestricted humanitarian access to support the most vulnerable. Madam President, we call upon the military to immediately lift the state of emergency, restore power to the legitimate civilian government, release all those unjustly detained, and to respect human rights and the rule of law. The results of the November elections must be respected, and Parliament should convene at the earliest opportunity. Malta reiterates its support to Myanmar's civilian and democratic transition and stands with its people to ensure that democracy prevails. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Lao People's Democratic Republic on Zoom.
Madam President, as an immediate neighboring country and ASEAN fellow, the Lao PDR has been followed by the development in Myanmar. We reiterate the importance of maintaining the political stability in ASEAN member states to achieve a peaceful, stable, and prosperous ASEAN community. We are of the view that the international community should create a conducive environment for Myanmar to resolve its internal differences through peaceful means in order for Myanmar to continue its democratization process as well as national development. In conclusion, we would like to emphasize the importance of the guiding principle of Human Rights Council, including the principle of non-selectivity and constructive international dialogue and cooperation. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Luxembourg by video message.
Madam President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. Luxembourg expresses its full solidarity with the people of Myanmar and strongly condemns the military coup d'etat. The armed forces should show full restraint in front of demonstrations of civilians. They should free all political prisoners, remove all obstacles to civil and political rights, especially the freedom of the press and opinion and expression, and restore access to the internet, and finally submit themselves to civilian oversight as soon as possible. My delegation supports the resolution to be adopted. We renew our appeal to all authorities of Myanmar to ensure unimpeded access to the set of protections of human rights of the United Nations. Impunity for large-scale violations of human rights should be ended once and for all, especially the crime of genocide against the Rohingya and crimes of war crimes that are committed against them and other ethnic minorities. Impunity encourages repetition of the most serious of crimes. Targeted and effective restrictive measures against the junta and its economic interests should be studied. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Croatia for a video message.
Thank you, Madam President. Croatia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We are deeply concerned with the course of events in Myanmar and strongly condemn unconstitutional seizure of power by the military forces, which imposed a year-long state of emergency, creating a climate of fear and repression. Particularly troubling are the latest reports of police using water cannons and rubber bullets on peaceful protesters. We invite the military leadership to refrain from violence against civilians and to respect the rights of the people of Myanmar to peacefully protest and express their opinion. The restrictions on civil society journalists and media workers are additionally concerning. We call for prompt release of all detainees and restoration of democratically elected government. Any allegation of election irregularities has to be processed through the proper legal mechanisms. Recent events have trampled Myanmar's 10 years long democratic transition and overshadowed efforts invested in peace process and national reconciliation. We underline our support for restoration of democratic process and full respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms and the rule of law in order to create conditions necessary for addressing past and ongoing human rights violations in the country. In this sense, we express our full support to the ongoing mandate of independent investigative mechanisms for Myanmar in ensuring justice and accountability. Croatia calls all parties to find an urgent way out of the crisis through de-escalation and an inclusive national dialogue. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Finland for a video message, followed by Turkey on Zoom, then Switzerland by Zoom. Finland, you have the floor.
Madam President, Finland aligns itself with a statement by the European Union. Finland condemns in the strongest terms the military coup carried out in Myanmar. Finland calls upon the military to immediately and without any conditions release the president, the state councillor and all those who have been arrested, exercise maximum restraint, respect all human rights, freedoms of expression and assembly and the rule of law. Finland also calls upon the military to immediately end the state of emergency, restore the civilian government, to open the newly elected parliament and to proceed with the subsequent appointments of the president, vice presidents and of the new government. Finland is very concerned of the attempts to limit freedoms of expression and assembly online and offline. Internet shutdowns and the targeted blockage of social media platforms cannot be used as political tools for preventing people from using digital space to express their ideas and defending their human rights. The internet should enable members of the civil society to advocate for their rights, share their views, and increase their access to information. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Turkey on Zoom.
Madam President? Madam President, do you hear me?
We hear you very clearly. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. We are deeply concerned about and strongly condemn the military takeover that took place in Myanmar on the 1st of February. As a matter of principle, Turkey has always been against any kind of coup d'etats and military interventions. We expect the immediate release of all the elected officials and political personalities and civilians who are detained. In that regard, we call upon the reconvening of the new parliament as soon as possible and prompt removal of all restrictions placed on the elected leaders and democratic institutions. We are particularly concerned about the fate and political future of Aung San Suu Kyi. We hope that this grave development will not worsen the plight of Rohingya Muslims living in Myanmar. The elections that took place in November 2020 was hailed by the international community as open and fair. We joined the European Union declaration condemning the military coup in the strongest terms. We are also among the countries who have supported convening of this special session and became a co-sponsor to the draft resolution on the agenda of this meeting. We are ready to support the international community to take a firmer stance against the military coup. The reaction of the military to the public protests will be a determining factor for the stability of the country as well as for future negative implications on human rights situation.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Switzerland on Zoom. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Madame la Présidente, la suite.
Madam President, Switzerland is seriously concerned with the recent events in Myanmar. We call upon the Burmese army to release all democratically elected persons and stop the repression of journalists and human rights defenders. Switzerland is in favor for the restarting dialogue to achieve sustainable peace and development. The recent events may seriously throw back the progress achieved by the country and the human rights situation exacerbated by the current health crisis. Switzerland would like to urge the Burmese authorities to provide access to the Office of the High Commissioner and Special Rapporteur and ensure dialogue between different parties. The situation of displaced persons in Myanmar may even further deteriorate, and we need a voluntary, safe return of the Rohingya refugees, something that is becoming more and more difficult. It is crucial that the voice of civil society is heard. Switzerland calls upon the Myanmar military to respect the freedom of assembly and peaceful demonstrations and refrain from any violence in line with international agreements that Myanmar should respect. It is crucial that to ensure the free use of internet that should be reestablished throughout the country. Thank you.
And I now give the floor to the United Nations Children's Fund by Zoom, followed by Australia by Zoom, followed by Vietnam by Zoom. The United Nations Children's Fund, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. UNICEF expresses deep concern regarding the impact of the ongoing crisis on children's well-being and reminds all parties of their obligations to uphold all children's rights as enshrined in the Convention on the Right of the Child, to which Myanmar is a state party, and under the Myanmar Child Rights Law enacted in 2019. These rights include the rights to protection, participation, peaceful assembly, and freedom of expression. They also include freedom from unlawful and arbitrary detention or separation from parents. In crisis situations, children are often disproportionately affected, and it is essential that all parties uphold the best interest of the child, one of the core principles of the CRC, as a primary consideration. In the context of ongoing demonstrations and current events and reports of injuries, some potentially fatal, UNICEF calls on all actors, including security forces, to exercise the utmost restraint, to resolve differences through constructive and peaceful means, and to prioritize the protection and safety of children and young people as they express their opinions. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Australia by Zoom.
Australia has serious concerns about the military coup in Myanmar and for its democratic transition. Elected government leaders, political leaders, officials, civil society figures and others have been arbitrarily detained. An Australian citizen, a respected economist, has been detained. We call urgently for his immediate release so he can return home to his family and for the release of all those who have been detained. We strongly urge the military to engage in dialogue to support a return to civilian rule and the reconvening of the National Assembly the Myanmar people so clearly want. We welcome the ASEAN Chairman's statement of 1 February, recalling the principles enshrined in the ASEAN Charter. We call on the authorities to ensure the protection of civilians and uphold human rights, including the right to peaceful assembly, to exercise utmost restraint and to refrain from any use of violence. Australia is deeply concerned about the potential impact of these events on humanitarian crises across the country, which disproportionately affect the most vulnerable. We urge unhindered humanitarian access. Australia's commitment to the people of Myanmar is long-standing and steadfast, and we restate that commitment here today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Vietnam by Zoom. Vietnam, you have the floor.
Vietnam, please unmute.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. We can see you and we can hear you. Please proceed.
Madam President, as a neighboring country and fellow ASEAN member, Vietnam has been closely following the current developments in Myanmar. As Myanmar undergoes democratic transition, the country is still tackling numerous daunting challenges, including the continuing decades-long ethnic armed conflicts, the old and new complex issues in Rakhine State, and the recent devastating impact of COVID-19 global pandemic. We reiterate that political stability in ASEAN member states is essential to achieving a peaceful, stable, and prosperous ASEAN community. We hope that Myanmar would soon stabilize the situation for national building and development, for peace, stability, and cooperation in the region, and continuing to contribute to the process of building the ASEAN community. In times like these, it is crucial that the international community and development partners continue their support for the democratic transition in Myanmar. Vietnam encourages the pursuance of dialogue, reconciliation, and the return to normalcy in accordance with the will and interests of the people of Myanmar. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Slovakia for a video message.
Madam President, Slovakia associates with the statement of the European Union and would like to add a few words in national capacity. Slovakia believes that all people have the right to live in peace and raise their children in a secure environment. The state they live in should be the first responsible for guaranteeing such a conducive environment, respecting the dignity and human rights of its citizens. After decades of oppression, people in Myanmar chose the path of democratic transition based on respect for human rights. The work of the HRC has also contributed to this. However, the recent coup d'etat has the potential to ruin a people's dream while bringing back oppression of human rights and violation of the rule of law. Arbitrary detentions, massive attacks of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly must be stopped immediately. Slovakia sees the urgency of addressing the current situation by the Human Rights Council and appreciates that the Human Rights Council members acted in this way, calling swiftly for a special session. We fully subscribe to the text of the draft resolution, with its strong appeals to put an end to human rights violations, with clear mandate for UN mechanism to help Myanmar's people revert to the path chosen by their free will. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Iceland for a video message.
Madam President, Iceland is deeply concerned over the situation in Myanmar. We condemn the recent military coup and the subsequent actions of the Myanmar security forces who have arbitrarily arrested and detained hundreds of people. We call for the immediate release of all civilians, including all political leaders. We remind the Myanmar military of the duty under international law to refrain from using excessive force against peaceful demonstrators protesting against the military coup. The world is indeed watching. Madam President, this is not the first time the situation in Myanmar is discussed by this august body. The Myanmar security forces stand accused of having committed genocide and crimes against humanity against the Rohingya people. The civilian leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi has faced condemnation as well for defending these acts. However, Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the NLD, were the clear victors of the recent elections. Its results must be recognized and the democratically elected government of Myanmar reinstated. Only with proper democracy, respect for human rights, and accountability for serious international crimes can the people of Myanmar enjoy the future they rightly deserve. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Tunisia for a video message, followed by Jordan on Zoom, followed by Spain on Zoom. Tunisia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation would like to express its deep concern in light of the recent developments in Myanmar after the takeover of power by the armed forces and the detention of political leaders in civil society. They must be immediately liberated, and the return to the constitutional system should be ensured with the respect of democracy and the rule of law. We're also concerned in the growing violence leading to civilian victims, especially in Rakhine State. We urge Myanmar to deal with the root causes of the Rakhine crisis and ensure that the conditions are created for voluntary return of Rohingya in conditions of dignity. Those who committed crimes should be held accountable. and the opinion of the ICJ should be respected. We regret the exclusion of the Rohingya candidates in the 2020 elections and the partial and full cancellation of the results of the voting, especially in Rakhine State. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Jordan by Zoom, followed by Spain by Zoom, followed by South Africa by Zoom.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدة الرئيسة.
Madam President, we would like to thank the Office of the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur for the update on the situation in Myanmar. We praise the central role played by our August Assembly in the area of human rights. We reiterate the importance of the following: to take the necessary measures to ensure the cooperation of Myanmar authorities with UN mechanisms and to respect the resolutions of the Council. Number two, the Council and any other human rights mechanism should not ignore the tragedy of the Rohingya and other ethnic and religious minorities in Myanmar. The responsibility lies on the shoulders of the authorities of Myanmar to protect religious and ethnic minorities and protect these minorities and ensure the return of displaced persons to their homes. And we also would like to stress the role of the international community to send a message in unity in light of this crisis. We need to reestablish peace and justice in order to ensure the population of Myanmar can enjoy peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Spain by Zoom.
Spain, please unmute.
¿Me oye ahora?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Gracias.
Thank you. Madam President, I'd like to express the thanks of Spain for holding this special session with so quickly in these difficult circumstances. This shows the flexibility that the Human Rights Council continue its works. Madam President, we align ourselves with a statement made by the European Union. We condemned the acts of the armed forces of Myanmar and ensure the reestablishment of civilian authorities in the country. The use of force should be stopped, especially against peaceful demonstrations, and also stop the repression of human rights defenders and protect the fundamental freedoms. We also urge the country to cooperate with UN human rights mechanism, especially with the Office of the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. Spain would like to urge a democratic transition and find a solution on the basis of democratic institutions of the country and in line with the principles established by the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to South Africa by Zoom, followed by the Maldives by Zoom.
Madam President, South Africa appreciates the convening of this special session aimed at addressing the latest developments concerning human rights in Myanmar. South Africa has indeed noted with serious concern the deterioration of civil and political rights in Myanmar over the past years. However, the current situation, including the detention of the state councillor, Do Aung San Suu Kyi, and other political leaders on the eve of the opening session of Myanmar's parliament, has amplified these concerns. Our government has joined the international community in calling for their immediate release and a return to the rule of law. These regrettable developments undermine democratic reforms undertaken in Myanmar following the general elections held on 8 November 2020. We call upon the military to respect the rule of law as well as international human rights and humanitarian law. South Africa firmly believes that political differences should be resolved through peaceful and inclusive dialogue. South Africa will continue to support the people of Myanmar in their pursuit of democracy, peace, human rights, and the rule of law. During crises, it is the vulnerable groups that bear the brunt, and the impact on women and children will be disproportionately felt. We appeal that the right of life and health are upheld as the world is reeling from the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Maldives, followed by Qatar. The Maldives, the floor is yours. Please proceed, Ambassador.
At the outset, let me express our appreciation to Madam President for addressing this urgent matter in a timely manner. The Maldives is deeply concerned about the rapidly deteriorating situation in Myanmar and its implications for the people of Myanmar. Maldives strongly condemns the state of emergency imposed by the Myanmar military on February 1st, following the military coup that ousted the democratically elected government and the arbitrary detention of members of the civilian government, including the chairperson of the National League for Democracy and State Council, Aung San Suu Kyi, and President Myint. We are presently concerned by the news of the suppression of the voice of the people in Myanmar through restrictions to internet access, telecommunications, media, and the clampdown on peaceful gatherings and protests. The government of Maldives calls on the military to immediately and unconditionally release all those who are placed under arbitrary detention, uphold the rule of law, and to respect and restore the democratic process. Further, the government of Maldives remains deeply concerned over the continued acts of human rights violations and escalation of violation against the Rohingya Muslims. We call on Myanmar to respect its human rights obligations and international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights covenants. At this critical time, the Maldives calls on Myanmar to engage in dialogue and reconciliation with the goal of restoring democracy and to take immediate steps to protect the human rights of all people. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Qatar, followed by Brunei Dar es Salaam. Qatar, the floor is yours.
السيدة الرئيسة تراقب دولة قطر عن كثب الأوضاع.
Thank you, Madam President. We have been following the recent developments in Myanmar, and we are seriously concerned in light of the human rights situation, a situation with fundamental freedoms. And these violations can harm the people and lead to further violations, especially the Rohingya Muslims. We would like to recall the importance to ensure respect for international law, international human rights law, and ensure that there are independent inquiries into human rights violations. The authorities of Myanmar should protect all minorities, including the Rohingya minority, and guarantee the right to obtain nationality and ensure a sustainable, free return in conditions of security to their homes and to avail themselves of international assistance, something that will help achieve national reconciliation and stability. Finally, we support the efforts of the international community and other stakeholders to find a solution to the situation in Myanmar through dialogue. We have to strengthen national dialogue to find a solution to the crisis in order to guarantee and preserve national unity and preserve the hopes of the Myanmar people to development, security, and peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Brunei Dar es Salaam.
Thank you. Madam President, thank you for giving me the floor. I have the honor to deliver our national statement at this special session. Brunei Darussalam is closely monitoring the situation in the Republic of the Union of Myanmar. Brunei Darussalam recalls the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter, in particular in promoting and encouraging the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Brunei Darussalam reaffirms that the political stability in all ASEAN member states is essential to achieving a peaceful, stable, and prosperous ASEAN community. We reiterate the ASEAN's chairman's statement of 1st February 2021, recalling the purposes and principles enshrined in the ASEAN Charter, including the adherence to the principles of democracy. the rule of law and good governance, respect for and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Brunei Darussalam encourages all parties concerned to seek political solution through dialogue and consultations in the spirit of friendship and mutual trust. Brunei Darussalam stands ready to work with Myanmar, both bilaterally and through ASEAN, towards a positive and peaceful outcome. We support all efforts to pursue reconciliation in accordance with the will and interests of the people of Myanmar. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I am now closing the Observer State segment. However, before moving on, I need to get back to the Member State segment. When I called the United Kingdom earlier on to read a joint statement, there was a technical problem and this could not be done. I will now give them the floor for a joint statement. The United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly, Ambassador. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. We are making a joint statement on behalf of the United Kingdom and Iceland to bring the Council's attention to a letter that has just been submitted to the Human Rights Council by a group of 300 elected members of the Parliament in Myanmar. Their letter contains the following passage, and I quote, "Excellencies, we urge you to immediately investigate the following matters which undermine any peaceful transition to democracy in Myanmar, regional stability, and international peace and security. Since the military coup on the 1st of February 2021, the Myanmar military committed grave human rights violations. It made illegal arrests and arbitrarily detained elected members of parliament, senior leaders from the National League for Democracy, including Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the president, government officials, human rights defenders, and civilians who take part in non-violent civil disobedience movements. The detainee list includes 300 now. The military also shot peaceful protesters, raided the ruling party's offices, and confiscated documents, records, and property. Moreover, it placed restrictions on people's freedom of speech by preparing a telecommunications bill intended to control access to the internet and mobile services. We urge the Human Rights Council to support our efforts." End quote. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. We have now come to the end of this morning's meeting, and we will reconvene at 3 p.m. to continue our discussions with a list of speakers from non-government organizations. This meeting is closed. Thank you.